The stranger's shock. The room was thick with tension as Lisa stood frozen, her mind scrambling for an explanation. Her fingers clenched tightly around the coffee pot, its warmth doing little to calm her nerves. She looked at Ivan, whose innocent face betrayed no understanding of the storm he had just sparked. His wide eyes were locked on the stranger, as if waiting for some kind of confirmation, some acknowledgement of the statement he had made. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. What did he mean by that? She asked herself, trying to make sense of it. She had never told Ivan anything about his father. There had been no mention of any other man in her life, certainly not a wealthy, well-dressed stranger sitting at the counter of Joe's diner. The man's expression, a mix of confusion and disbelief, did nothing to ease the panic bubbling up inside her. She glanced at him again. This man, dressed in an immaculate navy suit, his shoes polished to perfection. He appeared out of place in the warm, worn environment of the diner, where the walls were adorned with faded photos of the town's past, and the menu was still written on a chalkboard above the counter. Lisa had never seen him before, and yet Ivan's words suggested an undeniable connection. The stranger's voice broke through the silence. I'm sorry. I think you've mistaken me for someone else," he said, his tone calm but strained. He set his coffee cup down and leaned back in his stool, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the situation. Lisa forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She wiped her palms on her apron, trying to steady herself. "Ivan, sweetheart, can we talk for a minute?" she asked, her voice a bit too high-pitched, the nerves still evident. Ivan didn't respond immediately. His eyes were still fixed on the man, his face unreadable as he processed the stranger's reaction. Lisa crouched down beside her son, trying to bring some normalcy back to the moment, to ground him in the reality she understood. "Ivan, why would you say that? You know we've never talked about your dad, right?" she asked gently, her voice full of concern. But Ivan just shrugged, his gaze unwavering from the stranger. "Mom said you were my dad," he repeated, a hint of frustration now creeping into his voice, as though the truth was staring them both in the face, and they were the ones refusing to see it. Lisa stood up, running a hand through her hair, her thoughts whirling. This wasn't a conversation she was prepared for. She didn't know how to answer Ivan's claim. Did he really believe it? She wondered. She had raised him on her own, with no mention of his father. Her mind wandered to the past, to the years she had spent trying to build a stable life for them both, the decisions she had made, and the promises she had kept. But the stranger, the man at the counter, was the one who was truly perplexed. His brow furrowed, and he glanced nervously around the diner, as if searching for an escape from this strange, uncomfortable moment. He opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could get the words out, Lisa spoke first. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice firm but controlled. She was trying to regain control of the situation, to assert some semblance of authority in the face of this confusing turn of events. The man hesitated, his eyes darting from Lisa to Ivan, and back again. For a moment, it seemed like he was weighing his options, considering whether he should answer truthfully or make some excuse and leave. But in the end, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly in resignation. "My name is William Carter," he said quietly, his voice laced with unease. I'm a businessman." He glanced down at the counter, as though the surface might offer him some comfort or escape from the awkwardness of the moment. "I'm not sure what your son is referring to, but..." Lisa could see the struggle in his eyes. He wasn't exactly denying Evan's claim, but neither was he confirming it. His lack of clear denial only deepened her suspicion. There was something about him, something that didn't add up. The diner was growing quieter, the usual buzz of conversation replaced by the nervous tension that had taken over. Lisa could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, but she paid them no mind. This was about her son. This was about Ivan. She glanced down at Ivan, who was still staring at the man. There was no sign of fear or uncertainty in his eyys, only a calm certainty, as if he were simply waiting for the man to remember something that Lisa couldn't grasp. Lisa's mind raced. Was it possible? She had heard of people who were unknowingly connected, of long-lost family members, finding each other after years of separation. But this seemed impossible. She didn't even know this man. She had never met him before, and yet Evan, who had never shown any particular interest in a father figure, had made this startling declaration. "I don't know what to say," William Carter muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached for his coffee again, but his hand was shaking slightly. "I can't explain this." Lisa wasn't sure what she expected from him, but this reaction, this admission of uncertainty, did little to help clarify the situation. She stepped forward, crossing her arms in front of her. Her frustration was building, but she fought to keep it contained. She needed answers. "How would my son know your name?" she asked, her voice steady, but the edge of suspicion was clear. And why would he say something like that if it weren't true? William hesitated again, his jaw clenching as though he was deciding how much of the truth to reveal. After a long moment, he seemed to reach some kind of decision. He exhaled slowly and looked Lisa in the eye. "I can't explain this, but years ago, I was involved with a woman. We had a brief relationship, and it didn't work out. I didn't know she was pregnant, and I never had any reason to believe that I had a child," he admitted. His voice was quiet, the weight of his words heavy in the air. "But your son, he could be mine." Lisa's stomach churned as she processed his words. The truth seemed to be unraveling slowly, like a thread pulled from a tangled ball of yarn. Was this possible? Could Evan really be the child of this man? And then, without warning, Evan stood up from the booth, his small hands clutching his coloring book. He looked at William Carter, his expression calm and unbothered. "Are you my dad?" he asked simply, his voice high-pitched and innocent, but his words carrying the gravity of a question no child should have to ask. William stared at him, his eyes wide. He opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. His mouth closed, then opened again, but nothing came out. Lisa's heart was in her throat. She had never felt more lost than she did at that moment. The truth was unfolding before her, but it was still unclear. And for the first time in her life, she was unsure of what the future held for her and Evan. Unraveling truths. The diner felt smaller, the space constricting as the weight of the conversation hung thick in the air. William Carter, still frozen in disbelief, was staring at Evan, unable to process the gravity of what had just been said. Evan, for his part, seemed entirely unfazed, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world to look a stranger in the eye and ask if they were his father. Lisa, however, was anything but unfazed. Her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the fragments of information she'd just been given. This man, William Carter, was connected to her son in ways she couldn't even fathom, and yet she couldn't see how. The other patrons of Joe's diner were uncomfortably quiet, their meals forgotten as they observed the unfolding drama. Lisa felt their eyes on her, but she couldn't focus on them. Her attention was entirely consumed by the situation before her. She felt the pull of the past tugging at her, memories she'd long tried to bury resurfacing in the wake of William's admission. Years ago, when she had been much younger, she had made choices that she thought were long behind her. The past had always felt distant, like a forgotten chapter in a book. But now, those memories were crashing back into the present with a vengeance. Lisa glanced at Evan, who was now sitting back down at the booth, his legs swinging slightly above the floor. His innocent question echoed in her mind, and she felt a pang of guilt. Could he really be his son? The idea seemed impossible, yet William's words, his confession, made it all too plausible. She had never told Evan about his father, and she had certainly never expected someone like William Carter to walk into her life again, let alone claim to be a part of it. Taking a deep breath, Lisa steadied herself and turned to face William. "You never knew," she said, the words coming out more like a statement than a question. She wasn't sure what she expected him to say, but the uncertainty in his eyes told her everything. He hadn't known. He still didn't know. How could you not know? Lisa continued, her voice low and tight, trying to control the anger that was beginning to build within her. How could you be so careless? William seemed to shrink under her gaze, as if the weight of her words was beginning to settle on him. He glanced down at his hands, which were nervously clasped together. "I didn't know," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. We were young. I was focused on my career. I didn't even think about it." Lisa clenched her fists at her sides, trying to keep the emotions in check. She had always prided herself on being in control of her life, but here she was, standing in front of a man she barely knew, facing the possibility that he could be the father of her son. The son she had raised alone, with no one to share the responsibility, no one to help her through the sleepless nights or the long days of struggle. But William wasn't finished. "I'm not proud of how I handled things," he said, his voice tinged with guilt. "I didn't realize that there was a child involved. I didn't know I had a son." He looked at Lisa, his eyes searching for understanding. "If I had, things would have been different." Lisa shook her head, disbelief still clouding her thoughts. "You think you can just waltz in here after all these years and make excuses?" she asked, her voice barely containing her frustration. "You've had a life, a career, a family, and I've been here, raising him on my own. You don't get to just show up and act like you've got a right to be a part of it now." Her words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. William flinched, and for a moment, she thought he might back away, retreating into his comfortable world of wealth and status. But instead, he stood up from his stool, his face set with a new determination. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice firmer now. "I'm not asking for anything. But I need to know the truth. Is he mine?" Lisa's heart skipped a beat as the question settled between them like a heavy stone. Was Evan really his son? Could it be true? The very thought was absurd, and yet there was a certain logic to it. If what William was saying was true, then this was no coincidence. This meeting, this moment, was somehow fate or something far more complicated. She looked at Evan, who was now sitting quietly, coloring in his dinosaur book again, oblivious to the intensity of the conversation. He was so innocent, so pure, that it made her want to shield him from the world, from all the pain and confusion that seemed to be surrounding them. Lisa turned back to William. "I don't know," she said, her voice softening, though her frustration remained. "I don't know if he's your son. I never wanted you to know about him. I didn't want you to have any claim on him. But now," her voice trailed off, the weight of the situation beginning to sink in. William seemed to absorb her words, nodding slowly. He didn't push her further, didn't try to argue or demand more. He seemed to understand that this wasn't something that could be fixed with a simple apology. The damage had been done years ago, and the past could not be undone. "But what do we do now?" William asked, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "What happens next?" Lisa didn't have an answer. She didn't know what to do. She had spent so many years carving out a life for herself and Evan, building a sense of security that had felt impenetrable. But now everything was unraveling, like a knot slowly coming undone. For a moment, the diner was completely still. The clinking of silverware and the sizzling of bacon seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the silence that now enveloped them. Evan, still absorbed in his coloring book, looked up suddenly, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Are you going to stay, Mr. Carter?" he asked innocently, as if it were the most natural question in the world. "You're my dad, right?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread, tugging at the very heart of the situation. William's expression softened as he looked at Evan, his gaze no longer filled with confusion, but with something else, something Lisa couldn't quite place. I don't know, Evan," William replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I'm your dad. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." not without finding out the truth. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The world felt different now, like everything had shifted under her feet. She didn't know where this path would lead, but it was clear that neither she nor Even could turn back. The path to discovery. The days that followed the fateful encounter at Joe's diner were a blur for Lisa. She couldn't escape the nagging feeling that everything she had built, everything she had fought for, was on the brink of collapse. It wasn't just the bombshell that William Carter might be Even's father. It was the sheer unpredictability of it all. How could she have known that one moment, one conversation, would change everything? For years, she had kept her life carefully curated, each piece in place, each boundary respected. She'd raised Even alone, with no help from anyone, least of all from the man who was now standing in front of her, claiming to be her son's father. And yet, as much as she wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave and never return, there was a part of her that couldn't help but wonder. What if he was telling the truth? What if, after all these years, Even was not just the product of her struggles, but of a long-lost relationship? A relationship that had, until now, remained buried deep within the folds of her past. Lisa had always believed that secrets, if left to fester long enough, would eventually be unearthed. And now, it seemed, the time had come for hers to be revealed. It was late afternoon when Lisa finally agreed to meet William again. She wasn't sure why she had agreed. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps something deeper. But she found herself standing outside her small apartment, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, waiting for him to pull into the parking lot. The shadows of evening were creeping in, the sky tinged with hues of pink and gold, and Lisa's thoughts were filled with doubt. When William's sleek black car finally pulled up, its engine purring like a lion, she felt a wave of unease ripple through her. He stepped out, dressed in a dark suit that made him seem even more out of place than before. The sharp contrast between him and the modest town they both inhabited could not have been starker. But that didn't matter now. None of the usual concerns, his wealth, his status, mattered anymore. What mattered now was what they were about to face. "You wanted to talk," he said, his voice steady, but with a trace of uncertainty beneath the surface. "I'm here." Lisa swallowed hard. She had been thinking about this conversation all day, and now that it was finally happening, she wasn't sure where to begin. "I don't know what to think, William," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I've spent my entire life keeping things together for Even, for me. And now, this," she gestured vaguely, her words caught somewhere between frustration and disbelief. William didn't respond right away. He seemed to be measuring his words carefully, as though he, too, was trying to come to terms with the gravity of the situation. "I know this is hard," he said after a pause. "But I need to understand. I need to know the truth about Even. He deserves to know, too." Lisa felt her heart tighten. Does he deserve to know? She wondered. Does it even matter anymore? Her mind flickered back to the years before, to the life she had lived. She had been young and naive, caught up in a whirlwind of emotions, believing that she could control everything. She had never asked for William Carter to be a part of her life, and yet his shadow seemed to loom over her now, as though he had been waiting, patiently, to return. "I don't know how to explain it," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "You were a part of my life, but you were never supposed to be in Even's. I kept him away from the past, because that's all it was, just the past." William's expression softened, and he took a step closer to her. "I'm not asking to be a part of your life, Lisa. Not the way you think. But I can't just walk away from this without knowing the truth." A silence fell between them, thick with tension. Lisa's thoughts swirled, and she found herself at a crossroads. One path leading to the unknown, the other back to the comfort of the life she had built, a life that no longer seemed as solid as it once had. "How do we even start?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was that night, after much deliberation, that they agreed to a DNA test. It felt like the only way to find some clarity, to answer the question that had been plaguing them both. Was Evan really his son? The uncertainty was unbearable, and Lisa knew that the only way to move forward was to face the truth head-on, no matter how difficult it might be. The following week passed slowly. Lisa's days were filled with the humdrum of daily life. Serving coffee at Joe's, picking up Evan from school, grocery shopping, but her mind was never far from the looming test results. Every time she looked at Evan, she found herself searching for some sign that could confirm the truth. Did he look like William? Was there something in his eyes that betrayed the bloodline he shared with this stranger? But every time she looked at him, she saw only her son, the little boy who had never once questioned the absence of a father, who had never once wondered why his family was so different from the others. Evan, for his part, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. He spent his afternoons drawing, playing with his friends, and asking Lisa innocent questions about life. He had no concept of the magnitude of the decision they were all about to make. When the day finally came, Lisa and William met at the clinic, both of them on edge. Lisa's stomach churned with anticipation, while William seemed distant, lost in his own thoughts. They sat in silence, the sterile, clinical atmosphere of the waiting room amplifying the tension between them. Neither of them spoke a word as the minutes ticked by, their thoughts locked on the single piece of paper that would change everything. Finally, the nurse arrived, holding the envelope in her hands. She didn't say anything, simply handed it to Lisa, who took it with trembling fingers. The weight of it felt heavier than anything she had ever held before. Lisa opened the envelope slowly, her hands shaking, and pulled out the results. William leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the paper in her hands, his breath held in anticipation. Lisa took a deep breath before reading the results aloud, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. The results show a 99.9% probability that William Carter is Evan Harrington's biological father. The words echoed in the small room, and for a moment, everything went quiet. Lisa looked at William, and then at the results, her mind trying to process the truth that had just been confirmed. This was real. This was happening. Does this change anything? William asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa didn't know how to answer. Everything had changed. The burden of truth. The days following the DNA results felt like an endless sea of uncertainty, the shore never quite in reach. For Lisa, the truth that William Carter was Evan's biological father had become a weight too heavy to bear. It wasn't just the revelation itself, but everything it implied. The years of secrets, the choices she'd made in silence, the life she had carefully constructed for her son. It all seemed to crumble in the wake of the truth like sand slipping through her fingers. Every time she looked at Evan, she saw a new layer to him, something she hadn't noticed before. There was something in the way he smiled, a familiarity in the curve of his lips, the slight tilt of his head when he looked up at her that mirrored William's features. She couldn't deny the resemblance, though it tore at her heart. Was this what he deserved? She had kept him away from the past for so long, protected him from the father who had never known him, who had never asked about him. Was it fair to expose him to the possibility of a man who might only bring more chaos into their lives? But what was the alternative? To continue lying to him, to pretend that nothing had changed. William's presence loomed over Lisa's thoughts in the days following the test. He had not pushed for answers, not in the way she had expected. He had given her space, allowing her to come to terms with the fact that her past had once again collided with her present. But that only made the whole situation feel more alien, more like something out of a dream she didn't want to wake from. She couldn't ignore the impact of his wealth either. He was a man who had everything, who lived in a world that was nothing like the one she had even inhabited. Would he even know how to relate to his son after so many years of separation? Would he even try? It was a Tuesday afternoon when the phone call came. Lisa had just finished her shift at the diner and was cleaning off the counter when the number appeared on her phone screen. William. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the answer button. She hadn't spoken to him since the results had been confirmed, and the thought of opening up that door again made her feel vulnerable in ways she hadn't anticipated. Finally, she answered. "Hello." Her voice was tight, as though bracing herself for a confrontation, for demands, for questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Lisa." William's voice came through, calm and steady. "I've been thinking about everything. About Even. And I think it's time we talk." Lisa swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "I think it's time we tell him," William continued. "He deserves to know the truth, and I think it's time we stop pretending like this doesn't exist." Lisa's heart raced. She had expected him to say something like this. In the depths of her mind, she had known that he wouldn't let this go. But that didn't make it any easier to hear. "I don't know if he's ready," she replied, her voice low. "He's just a kid. This is a lot to take in." "I know," William said softly. "But he's old enough to understand that things aren't always as simple as they seem. I've thought about this for a long time, and I believe we owe it to him to tell him, to be honest with him." Lisa closed her eyes, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She hadn't known what she expected from William, but it certainly wasn't this quiet, determined resolve. He was right. In a way, Even deserved the truth. He deserved to know that he wasn't just some accident, some forgotten mistake from the past. He deserved to know where he came from, who his father was. But at the same time, Lisa wasn't sure if she was ready for that conversation. She had spent so many years protecting Evan from the complexities of life, from the complications of relationships that hadn't worked out. She wasn't sure how to unravel that protective shell now. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice thick with uncertainty. "But I'm not making any promises." "I understand," William said. "Take your time, but don't wait too long. I'll be here whenever you're ready." And with that, he hung up. The next few days were spent in a haze of indecision. Lisa would catch herself staring at Even, wondering how to approach him, how to explain the unexplainable. The world had always made sense to him. A world where Lisa was the only parent he needed. A world where his small, tight-knit family was all that mattered. How would he react if she told him that there was another piece to his story, a piece that had been hidden for so long? It wasn't until one evening, when the two of them were sitting on the couch watching a cartoon, that the question came up, unexpected and innocent. Even, as he often did, leaned against Lisa and asked a question that seemed trivial at first, but was anything but. "Mom," he asked, his voice soft and contemplative, "what's a dad like?" Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She had been prepared for this question in some form or another, but hearing it in that moment, in that simple, matter-of-fact way, took her by surprise. "Well," she began, her voice unsteady, "a dad can be a lot of things. Someone who loves you, takes care of you, helps you when you need it." Even turned his head, his curious eyes looking up at her. "Like Mr. Carter?" he asked, his voice so innocent, so sure of the question's simplicity. Lisa froze. Mr. Carter. The name seemed to hang in the air like a heavy curtain, the meaning behind it far too complicated for the moment. How could she explain to her son that the man who had walked into their lives was the same man whose blood ran through his veins? How could she make him understand that his world, the world he had known, was about to change forever? Evan's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "He's nice. He seems like a good dad," he added, his eyes filled with innocent wisdom. The words hung in the air, and Lisa realized in that moment that Evan had already made up his mind. To him, William wasn't a stranger. He was just someone who had entered his world, and from the simple clarity of a child's perspective, that meant that he could easily fit into the role of a father. Lisa didn't know if she was ready for what was coming, but she did know one thing. Her son was ready. The decision was made. The truth would be revealed. But as Lisa prepared to have the conversation, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, the moment when she would tell Evan about William, would be the beginning of something she wasn't prepared for. A new chapter was unfolding, one that no one could have predicted. The unraveling of walls. The following week passed in a blur of restless energy. Lisa had never been one to avoid confrontation, but this felt different. The conversation with Evan that she had been dreading was no longer just a theoretical event on the horizon. It was real. The time to tell him had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same after. She had never feared the unknown quite like this, but the weight of the truth, and the way it threatened to change everything, loomed over her. Every evening, as Evan did his homework at the kitchen table, Lisa found herself distracted. She would often pause mid-task, staring out the window, her thoughts swirling like a storm that wouldn't calm. She knew that telling him about William was the right thing to do. Evan had to understand the world he was a part of, the history that had shaped his life. But that didn't make it any easier to digest. How could she explain this complicated, tangled web of relationships to a child who had never known anything other than the simplicity of his small family? She had spent the last 7 years of Evan's life building a solid foundation for him, a world where he didn't question the absence of a father. And now, everything she had worked for, everything she had carefully protected, seemed poised to shatter in an instant. It was late one Thursday evening when Evan finally asked the question again. "Mom," he said, his voice tentative, a little unsure, "who is Mr. Carter really? Why does he keep coming around?" Lisa's heart clenched. The simplicity of the question cut through her like a knife. She had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, but now that it was here, she found herself at a loss for words. "Mr. Carter is, well, he's someone from the past," Lisa began, her voice faltering. "Someone I used to know." She paused, feeling the weight of the truth pressing on her chest. "And he's been trying to get to know you." Evan stared at her, his small face filled with confusion. "But why?" he asked. "I already know you, Mom. You've always taken care of me." Lisa forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, I have," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes there are things in life that we don't understand at first. Things that don't always make sense. And right now, we're going through one of those moments." Evan squinted up at her, his innocent curiosity never wavering. "Does he want to be my dad?" The question hit Lisa like a freight train. She wasn't sure how to answer. She wasn't even sure if William had ever wanted that, at least not in the way Evan might expect. But could she lie to him? Could she continue to shield him from the truth for much longer? I don't know, sweetheart," she said, her voice breaking. "But he's trying to be a part of your life, and I think you deserve to know why." Evan's brow furrowed, and he leaned back in his chair, his little hands folded across his chest. "So he's my dad, right?" he asked again, this time with more certainty. Lisa hesitated, her eyes filled with sadness and regret. "It's complicated, Evan," she said quietly. "It's a long story, one I didn't know how to tell you until now. But yes, in a way, he's your dad. He's your biological father." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, settling over the room with an undeniable weight. Evan's eyes widened, but there was no shock, no immediate reaction. He simply blinked, as though processing the information. "But you're my mom," he said, his voice filled with the simple clarity that only a child could have. "And you're the one who always takes care of me. So I don't need another dad." Lisa's heart melted at his words. The innocence, the unwavering trust in her, made everything feel even more complicated. She wasn't sure if Evan fully understood the magnitude of what he had just learned, but there was something comforting in the way he saw the world. To him, the idea of another father was just another concept to be processed, but it didn't change the love he had for Lisa. And that was what mattered most to him. "That's right," Lisa said, forcing a smile. "You don't need another dad. I've always been here, and I always will be." But even as she said those words, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. The truth had been spoken, and the world that Evan had known was already beginning to shift. The days after that conversation felt like a delicate balance. Lisa kept up appearances at work, kept up with the routine at home, but something had changed. She couldn't quite place it. Perhaps it was the distance she felt from Ivan, or the way he seemed to search her face every time they spoke about William. He wasn't pushing for answers anymore, but she could tell that he was processing everything in his own way, his young mind piecing together the fragments of truth she had only begun to give him. It wasn't until the weekend that the next big step came. William asked to meet Ivan. He had been patient up until that point, giving Lisa space, but now he wanted to take the next step in what was rapidly becoming an inevitable shift in all of their lives. He wanted to know Ivan, wanted to see if there was any connection between them beyond the blood that linked them together. Lisa hadn't planned on this meeting. She hadn't prepared Ivan for it, and part of her wasn't sure if she was ready for it herself. She had always done everything on her own, always kept things close to the chest, and now it felt like everything she had worked for was unraveling in front of her. "I don't know if this is a good idea," she said, pacing in the living room the night before the meeting, even still processing everything. "I don't want to push him too fast." William was standing by the door, watching her. "Lisa, I understand your hesitation, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm not here to take over. I'm here to give him a choice. If he doesn't want me in his life, I will respect that. But he deserves to know he has a father." The sincerity in his voice hit Lisa like a wave, and she felt the conflicting emotions stirring inside her once more. Was she truly ready to let this happen? To allow William to step into their lives fully? "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I'm ready to open that door. What if it all falls apart?" William stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "Sometimes we have to take risks to find out what's possible. I won't force anything, Lisa, but I'm asking you to trust me. Trust that I'm doing this for Ivan. I want him to know who I am, and I want him to decide what role I play in his life." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. She had never felt more torn, more uncertain. But she knew deep down that William was right. Ivan had a right to know. And she had to let go of the walls she had built to protect him, to let him decide what kind of relationship he wanted with the man who might very well be his father. The next day, they met at a local park. Lisa and Ivan arrived first, sitting on a bench beneath the sprawling oak trees, the morning sun casting long shadows over the grass. Ivan seemed curious but not nervous, his small legs swinging as he looked around, his eyes wide with wonder. When William arrived, he took a deep breath before walking over. He had changed out of his usual suit, now dressed casually in a navy polo shirt and khaki pants. He looked less like the millionaire business tycoon, and more like a father who was nervous about meeting his son for the first time. Ivan stood up when he saw him, his little face betraying a mix of emotions. "Hi, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice shy but polite. "Hey, Ivan," William replied, crouching down to his level. "I've heard a lot about you." Lisa watched from the bench, her heart pounding as she witnessed this pivotal moment in their lives. The air was thick with anticipation, and all she could do was wait and hope that, somehow, this would be the beginning of something good. The beginning of a relationship, a bond that no one could have predicted. And as William extended his hand to Ivan, Lisa realized that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. A new beginning. The meeting at the park that day marked the beginning of something none of them could fully grasp. William Carter, the man who had once been a distant figure in Lisa's past, was now standing before her son, trying to bridge a gap that had existed for 7 years. The tension in the air was palpable, yet there was something strangely calm about it too, a sense that no matter how uncertain this moment was, it was necessary. As William crouched down to Ivan's level, extending his hand with a warm, tentative smile, Lisa felt a tight knot in her chest, loosened just a little. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was real. And that was more than she had expected when she had first learned of the truth. shy but curious, eyed the outstretched hand before slowly reaching out. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, a single, fleeting instant when everything hung in the balance. Even grasped William's hand, and something unspoken passed between them. A tiny spark of connection, fragile yet undeniable. "Hi, Mr. Carter," Even said again, his voice no longer as hesitant. It was a simple greeting, but there was a clarity in it, an openness that Lisa hadn't seen before. Her son was ready for something she hadn't been able to give him on her own, and that realization struck her with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. "Hey, Even," William said softly, his voice a little hoarse, as though the weight of the moment had settled on him too. "I've heard a lot about you. Your mom tells me you're quite the artist." Even's face lit up, a shy grin spreading across his face. "I like to draw dinosaurs," he said proudly. "I want to be a paleontologist when I grow up, like the people who dig up the big bones." Lisa smiled softly, feeling a pang of sadness in her chest. She had never been able to provide Even with a father figure, someone to guide him through the complexities of life in ways she couldn't. She had been everything for him, but now, seeing Evan interact with William, something in her heart whispered that this wasn't a replacement. This was an addition. It wasn't about taking away what they had built together. It was about expanding their world. William's eyes softened. "A paleontologist, huh? That's impressive. I've always thought the world of dinosaurs was fascinating. Maybe you can teach me a thing or two about them sometime." The conversation flowed in small, simple exchanges, moments that allowed both Even and William to take tentative steps toward each other. Lisa watched silently, her heart heavy with emotion. She had feared this moment. The meeting, the opening of a door that could never be closed again. But as she saw Even laughing at one of William's awkward jokes, she realized that maybe she had underestimated the potential for healing, for growth, for new beginnings. After some time, they walked together along the park's winding trails, Lisa trailing behind them, her thoughts tangled in 1,000 different directions. The sight of her son laughing alongside the man she had once known felt surreal. Was this what it was supposed to be? Could they really build a new kind of family from the remnants of a broken past? As the days passed, Lisa found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She had always been fiercely protective of her son, always convinced that she was enough, that the two of them, just the two of them, could face the world and make it their own. But seeing the genuine connection between William and Even, hearing her son talk excitedly about the possibility of having a father figure in his life, began to change her perspective. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the tension between her and William flared, when old hurts surfaced, when the reality of their past together threatened to reassert itself. But it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about Even. It was about giving him the opportunity to know both of his parents, to understand that he didn't have to choose between them. And so, Lisa took baby steps. She allowed herself to trust William, little by little. She allowed him to spend more time with Even, to take him out for ice cream, to help with homework. She watched from the sidelines, often holding her breath, waiting for something to go wrong. But it didn't. William never overstepped. He never tried to replace her. He simply wanted to be there, and for Even. That was enough. It was a few weeks later when William invited Lisa and Even to his home for dinner. Lisa had hesitated at first, unsure of what such an invitation might imply. Was he trying to force a family dynamic that wasn't ready? Or was this a genuine step toward building something new? She didn't know. But Even was excited. He had been talking about the big house for days, asking questions about what it might be like. It was clear he was eager to see the world that his biological father inhabited, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. And so, after much deliberation, Lisa agreed. She knew she couldn't hide from this forever. When they arrived at William's house, Lisa was taken aback by how different it felt from their modest home. The sprawling mansion was a far cry from their cozy apartment, with its sweeping views of the city and its vast, tastefully decorated rooms. It felt like walking into another world, one that was glamorous and polished, yet strangely cold, as if it had never really been lived in. William greeted them at the door with a warm smile, dressed in a casual button-down shirt and jeans, a far cry from the suits he often wore at work. He had clearly put thought into the evening, preparing a meal and offering Even a chance to explore his new surroundings. Lisa had to admit that there was something endearing about his effort to make the night comfortable, even though the setting felt intimidating. The dinner itself was simple but delicious: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a salad. But it wasn't the meal that mattered. It was the conversation, the moments where Lisa allowed herself to relax just a little, to see the way William interacted with Even, the way he took interest in Even's dinosaur drawings, and asked questions about his favorite subjects in school. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was enough for now. As the evening drew to a close, Lisa found herself standing in the living room, watching William and Even talk about a new dinosaur exhibit that had opened at the museum. She could see the change in Even, the way he looked at William with a kind of admiration, a desire to connect, to belong. It wasn't about replacing her. It wasn't about disrupting the life they had built. It was simply about expanding the family, about opening a door to a future that had once seemed impossible. When it was time to leave, Even was reluctant to say goodbye. He had enjoyed the evening more than Lisa had expected, and she could see the bond forming between him and William, something that wasn't based on obligation, but on a shared curiosity and the simple joy of spending time together. "Thanks for having us, William," Lisa said, her voice soft. "I didn't know how this would go, but I think we can do this." William smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. "I'm just glad you came. And I'll always be here, Lisa, for both of you." As they drove home, Lisa's heart felt full, though there was a tinge of sadness mixed with the hope. She had always been the one to protect Even, to give him everything he needed. But now she saw that it wasn't just her anymore. Even had a father, and though the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, they were no longer alone in it. Even, who had been unusually quiet on the ride home, suddenly spoke up from the back seat. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with wonder, "do you think Mr. Carter will be my real dad now?" Lisa glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her heart swelling with emotion. "No matter what happens, sweetie," she said, her voice steady, "you already have a real dad. You have me." Even smiled softly, as though the words reassured him more than anything else, and as they pulled into their driveway, Lisa realized that while their world had shifted, it was still their world, a world that could still be filled with love, even if it looked different than before.